Welcome back to my show band friends who are joining us for yet another video talking through the process. Today, we had the pleasure of interviewing the great Dr. Daryl Singleton. He currently serves as the Assistant Professor of Black Music in America and Social Justice, as well as Jazz Percussion at Washington State University. Many of us know Daryl from his time in Texas, and he'll talk a little bit about that in the interview. I think this is, if you've watched the two previous interviews with Derek, with Catherine, this is really a different spin. It's a very creative take on how we view and how we think about the show band design process. I think you'll thoroughly enjoy Daryl's take. So with that, let's dive right in. We're going to start by talking about music specifically, and the first question of dynamic levels. What should judges expect from show bands at soft moments, at loud moments, and how does Daryl creatively view that?
And I guess I'm probably skipping to that second question where it says, when it comes to dynamic levels, what should a judge expect in a show band production? Because I think that's super important also. First thing is that an adjudicator should expect less intentionally extreme dynamic contrast on the soft end. Okay. There will always be some contrast, should be always some contrast, because that's something that, contrast is what helps make art tension and release, and so music a lot of times is done with the dynamics or intensity, depending on which term you decide you use to refer to that, right? It should align with the original musical context. And what I mean by that is, if a band is doing, I don't know, a show that involves some Mahler or some Stravinsky or whatever, right? And that music in its original context goes from the very, very, very soft to the very, very, very loud. But if a band is doing a show of Michael Jackson music, it was never presented from the very, very soft to the very, very loud. It would have variances in texture, right? A tune on the radio, it'll get to its moment where it's just drums or just bass line or just this, that, and the other, right? But it's more on a Baroque type dynamic contrast, where it's terrace dynamics because the texture is changed and the instrumentation is changed, rather than, okay, now we're going to get really, really, really soft, and now we're going to get really, really, really loud, right? And I'm really mainly talking about soft, right? If a lot of the music, especially within a particular piece, is not going to have as much soft in, right? As much less intense in. Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be. That doesn't mean that a director might choose music that has intentional soft spots and intentional points as far as intensity is concerned. But my concern would be that a director that doesn't choose to do that and be penalized in an adjudicator's mind for not including these things in a style that originally, this was not the point, right? And I think I mentioned this somewhere else in my in what I wrote down, but I'll just mention it now, is that drum corps and everything that has come out of drum corps started with the judge, right? It started with, we're going to do this in front of judges. That's how DCI started, right? So marching band was not that, and show band definitely was not that, right? So an example that I wrote down is with a drum line. What we consider a roll in contemporary marching band, a drum roll, is really 30-second notes. And that is what we expect to hear, and that is what we expect to see. One of the reasons that it evolved into that is because when drum corps are being judged, oh, this isn't clean enough, right? And no, everybody's not doing the same thing. So in order to accent to highlight the idea that everybody's doing the same thing, we begin to have rolls that are 30-second notes, rudiments such as drags, which were originally dot, drat, dot, drat, dot, drat, dot, drat, dot, have now become dot, 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 because art followed the adjudication and it adapted itself to the adjudication, right? And for me, that's philosophically, that's a challenge for me, especially when it comes to show band, because it comes out of a culture, right? And when the adjudication not respectful, aware, whatever word you want to use, of the culture that produced art, then the adjudication becomes somewhat arbitrary or not applicable to form, if that makes sense. Right now, my job is primarily jazz oriented, right? Where I am now, okay? And so for the last couple of years, I've adjudicated quite a few jazz festivals, right? And, which is a huge thing. And it's funny because up here, marching band is not as prevalent as it is the further south you go. One reason simply because of the weather, right? It's not, you know, so, and in the state of Washington, so for instance, in Texas, we have UIL, and in a lot of states, you have MEA related competitive or adjudicated performance opportunities, right? Here in the state of Washington, there is no such thing as that for marching band. The marching band festival run by universities. The ones that are there, they're run by a university or a high school puts it on, but it's not organized in a way at a state level or a district level, the way that a lot of states have it, right? But jazz band festivals are huge, right? And so having adjudicated these jazz band festivals, I have seen even in jazz band, I saw a band that was adjudicated, and I saw the judge, the adjudicator, make some comments to the band about the number of times that they hit a peak intensity, right? And I can't remember exactly how he put it, but his point was, once you've heard loud, I don't need, you know, I don't want to hear it that often, right? But when you consider a Count Basie performance, or you consider a Stan Kenton performance, consider, you know, we could name a whole bunch of big bands, right, that this style is based on, they would definitely not only hit that peak level, you know, one time. Like, save it for this one passage, don't ever get to them again. Or, you know, I mean, yes, there are some pieces that you do that in, but that's not a general aesthetic, because these are dance men. The aesthetic is dance, right? And so you want it to be exciting all night. That's what this music came out of, and that is the tradition that is being preserved and put forth when you're playing in a big band, right? You see what I mean? So I consider that as inappropriate as what we're talking about, putting a drum corps mentality on show band or even military band for that matter, right? Okay, so now the second half of that is the majority, however, the majority of educators I work with are players. They play jazz, they love jazz, and they're excited by jazz. And when we have to pick a sweepstakes winner for a festival during the day, you know, or, you know, the best of day and things like that, the talk is generally, one of the first things people talk about is, did they swing? Right? Not, you know, so I've seen bands play the, you know, a Maria Schneider chart that, you know, that shows all the technical nuances and all these things. But at the end of the day, they tend to award the best of the greater value to the band that's swinging, to the band that values improvisation, where the students are demonstrating that they have an understanding of improvisation. Why? Because the adjudicators came out of the culture and the context that jazz big band is supposed to represent. I'm saying all that to say that in order for adjudicators to appropriately adjudicate, they have to appreciate. And this becomes a philosophical thing, right? And I know this isn't the point of the interview, but I think that it's important to note, right? And I don't know if I wrote this to you in an email or not, but I'm gonna say it here. As it wasn't part of my dissertation research when I did it, but it became part of my. I mentioned it in my dissertation because it happened. I attended 6 TMAA workshops. I did TMEA, TBA, TMEA, TBA, TMEA, TBA. And in 6 workshops, I may have heard sentences that dealt with show band. Okay. Now, I am not faulting anybody. I'm simply highlighting that there is no appreciation and understanding, then there can't be accurate, can't be effective, better word. There can't be effective adjudication for a particular expression, right? Because at the end of the day, we don't want to academize the culture out of art, right? I know that we're quantifying and we want to, especially because we're in the education system, that we want to be able to quantify and say, well, this is, and these are the numbers, and this is why this is good, and this is why it's not good, and we have rubrics, and when you fit in this rubric, that we're essentially translating aesthetics into quantitative data, right? And so I understand and I get that this is something that it is a limitation of how we do things. We're trying to be fair in all those things. And I understand that, and I'm not quibbling with that part of it, right? But I am saying that if a person has been raised to like a certain nuance of flavor in their food, and then you take them to South Louisiana and hit them with some kicking Cajun food, there's too much seasoning, there's too much this. This is not what food is supposed to taste like. It's not supposed to assault my senses. I mean, all the different analogies you could come up with, whether you're wine tasting or beer tasting, whatever. If you're used to a delicate whatever is delicate, and somebody hits you with a hammer on something, we're taken aback, and based on our frame of reference, which is all any of us have to go on, we can only respond to any stimuli that come our way based on our frame of reference and our background, right? And so I think until the adjudicating community has more awareness, exposure, and more than anything else, appreciation, it's going to be a challenge. And last analogy, and I've done, as you can tell, I'm kind of passionate about this part of it. I would compare it to opera versus Broadway. Both of them are musical theater. Both of them have costumes. Both of them have directors. Both of them have people that break into singing for apparently no reason. All all of these things are part of both art forms. But what makes good opera is not what makes good Broadway. And what makes good Broadway, not what makes good opera. And the rubrics, even though intonation is a thing in both, they are expressed differently. The amount of vibrato, for instance, that's appropriate in opera would not be appropriate in Broadway. but yet both genres value being on pitch, but it's expressed in a different way.
We're next going to talk about what feedback is helpful for students and directors regarding the descriptors, tone quality, and proper intonation in multiple ranges. And I think he does a great job of comparing these to the jazz ensemble. With his background, it totally makes sense with some really interesting analogies. So I hope you enjoy his response.
One, and this has a little bit to do with the judges. The judges tend to use terms like, and I heard these TMAA workshops, things like, oh, orchestral level of sound, as far as volume and things like that, right? A different set of descriptors would be helpful, right? Even if it was something as simple as number, more descriptors that could be applied without limiting the contextual background of the director and especially of the student. Okay, so that's something that I would say. Proper intonation, multiple ranges, maybe effective is a better word than proper. Right? Because and something I've heard from a lot of high school band directors is when an educator mentions characteristic tone, characteristic for who, characteristic for what? Going back to the opera versus Broadway, right? Or now let's throw gospel in the mix, right? If anybody that's been around classical singers for very long has heard somebody probably speak negatively of gospel singing, and they're screaming, and they're not taking care of their voice, and all these different things, right, that are from one frame of reference that are not necessarily not necessarily receiving the same value in a different genre, right? And again, I get it. I get that health is an issue. I get that vocal health is an issue, but I also get that if someone is wanting to express emotion with their voice in a particular way, that there's something that happens when somebody goes for that tone or goes for that vocal quality that doesn't happen when it's sung in a more formal, vocally, what some people would consider more refined training. Okay, so that would be a thing. Proper intonation, effective intonation across multiple ranges, right? When it comes to dynamic level, we kind of talked about that. Let me read through what I have here. Less intensity, extreme dynamic contrast on the soft end. There will/should be some contrast, but expected to align with the music's original content. That said, there will be some directors and arrangers that do make use of, for instance, pianissimo. But this should not become a why don't all bands do this thing. Consider that this style was not conceived in or for a pin drop silent audience. On the high volume and intensity side, expect high intensity. The pitch should not distort, but as long as the sound is controlled, high intensity and volume is a stylistic characteristic that is considered exciting and appropriate. Consider as an analogy, there are many fine sous chefs who are masters of subtle, delicate seasoning that is discernibly nuanced to the experienced palate. But a Cajun chef or a Mexican salsa master is applauded for spice that kicks like a mule.
We next talked a little bit about the moods that he hopes to convey, and he gets a little bit into his design process, but also into just how he aims to teach these moods and convey them to the audience.
What is the point of my show, right? The point of my show is to basically have a party. A lot of times with show band, right? It's to have a party. It's to have a good time, and it's to show off the students' musical abilities. right? So if we're doing a field drill, I want them to groove with music and enjoy the pictures. That's what I want them to do, right? Uh, the average or the typical, I don't want to say average, the typical show band drill can take on the quality of like an Ohio State type drill where we're actually showing you what the music is talking about, right? And there's a lot of show bands that do that. FAMU does that a lot. A lot of bands do that where they'll make a picture. Prairie View has done that. A lot of bands have done that where they'll make a picture that has something to do with the song, right? I saw you walking in the rain, make an umbrella on the field, right? Or burn rubber on me, make a car on the field, right? All these different things. So it could be that, right? Or it could be we'll do a Parents in Motion show, and when it gets to the part where when it gets to the bridge, we're going to change the picture, right? We're going to rotate the diamond or whatever the case may be, right? When we go to the straight on the floor, you know, I call it swag drive. You know, when we shifted swag drive, that's just my personal term for it. You know, which is usually on a bridge or maybe on a chorus or something like that. You want something to happen that's going to go visually with hearing, right? And in that case, it's not so much about mood; it's about correlation, right? Like a music video, a dance oriented music video, right? Where when the music changes, you want to see the form change. You want to see their moving change, right? And so it's similar in a drill, right? And so it can be approached from a few different ways. A lot has to do with show planning. It has to do with is it a themed show, right? Because if it's a themed show, you might be making more pictures or more relevant spelling words or what the case may be. But if it's not a themed show, it might just be, hey, we're just going to go out here and have a good time, or we're going to do this tune, and this tune, and these tunes have nothing to do with each other, and that's okay, right? Which is something that is not typical on sports style, right? The show, there's a continuity, it has a theme, there's props and all these things, and we're seeing the metaphor of whatever the metaphor is for that show, and how Orpheus made it out of the underworld, or whatever the case. Right? It's beautiful, it's wonderful, right? But that's not always the case in the show band show, and it doesn't have to be, right? Sometimes it is. That's okay. Sometimes it isn't, and that's okay, right? I do want there to be some correlation to what they see in here, whether that's because the music changed and the music changed orally, and so we did something different visually, right? Or the music went to halftime, and we went into a death march or a halftime set, right? The music is changing into 3/4, and we're now rotating the wheel, whatever the case may be, right? Some type of correlation. So those are usually my goals when designing a show.
We had a great conversation about balance and goals and priorities and making sure melody and counter melody, and especially with his background as a percussionist, the role that percussion plays in the balance of the show band.
I think that all of that it's just music, right? I want to hear the melody. I want to be aware of the counter melody. I want it to sit on the accompaniment, and I want it to be driven by the percussion. Now, the difference is in the music, if you're doing popular music, percussion plays more of it. It should be in an intense level, right? I'm not even positive. I wasn't there when Sousa was doing his thing, but I'm not convinced that percussion wasn't intense back then. You know, because at the end of the day, a marching band marches, and percussion is what keeps that, right? So I know we've developed it. It has become this thing where, oh, you should be felt, not heard, and in a concert march and things like that. But I don't know. I wasn't there, but I kind of feel like, drums were prevalent originally. I mean, I tell people this all the time. Marching band has its origins in getting people's morale up about to get shot at. And there is documentation of people that went to war and said, if the band had not played in a rousing manner, we would have lost the day. Right. And I don't feel like that was a nuanced crescendo from pianissimo, whatever. Right. That's not the origins of what this is. And I'm not saying that there's a problem with the fact that it's evolved different ways, not having people getting shot at in front of the marching band. Right. But my point being that's what the roots of this whole genre is, whether you're in a drum corps or not. The roots of it is that, right? People's pride in belonging. That is what it was about. People's patriotism, people's allegiances to a cause. And that music was rousing, that music was boisterous, that music was energetic, right? So now we move down the line and we get into popular music and dance music and things like that. Percussion drives the kinetic response, right? And that is what the popular music is supposed to evoke, is a kinetic response in the listener. Body parts are supposed to move. Simple as that, right? And so percussion and the bass line carry that. So when you're listening to a show band playing a tune off the radio, a popular music tune off the radio, the percussion is going to be more prevalent if you're going to keep the music in the context in which it was originated. That doesn't mean you shouldn't hear the melody, but the percussion is going to be more present, right? I think between melody and counter melody, I think that there's not really a lot of variance there between one side and the other side, between different kinds of music. You want to hear the melody, you want to hear the counter melody. If something's, and basic musical principle apply. If something gets stated and then something else is stated along with it, that first thing that was stated has already made an imprint. It can back off of it. So now get focused on the next thing that comes in, because it's already in people's ears. They've already latched on to that. So I mean, all those things apply. But percussion will be a little bit more present. Now, that said about percussion, this is for directors and for something that judges can listen to, is keep your percussionists from being too busy, right? For instance, if I'm listening to a band and I can't discern the melody because there's too much parity between the melody and the counter melody and the other layers, if I listen to a percussion section and I can't discern groove because there's too much of the middle voices, right? Because the bass groove is basically going to be whatever the bass drums and 2 and 4, because that's what context that the music comes from. But if I've got so much going on in the tenor, I have chest tenor, single tenor drums, and going on in the corners, or so much going on in the snare part that obfuscates the groove. Because I used to get on my drum line a lot because they're trying to emulate some of the percussive sounds, some of the electronic percussive sounds, and all those things that are going on. And they're doing all that, and it's in there. But one thing that we have to remember as directors is that, and in drumline instructors especially, is that has been produced and it's been processed and it's been mixed so that even though you hear it very clearly, it's not at the same level as the principal parts of the group. And so that's something that drum lines can pay attention to, is make sure, is the groove present? Does it feel like what it's supposed to feel like, right? And this becomes a challenge for drummers because we're capable of doing a lot of things that are far beyond 2 and 4, right? And so we get bored, right? And so it's like, let's just throw this in here. Let's throw this in here. Let's throw this in here, right? And what I tell my drummer, that's what cadences are for. That's where you do you, right? That's what battle cadence, if you do stand cadences or if you do drum battles and things like that, that's what all that's for, right? You get to, and that's something that we don't think about. And I tell people this all the time. Why do you battle anyway? They get to play on the field like everybody else. I said, but you know what? A trumpet player is probably used, especially if he's the lead trumpet player on a field, using maybe 80% of what they know how to. They get to play runs. They get to play all these things. They get to play high. They get to have dynamic contrast. Here I am. So there needs to be an outlet for all my wherewithal as well. So that's, some people do that by via drum feature, right? But not all bands, especially with time limits that people have, not all bands do drum features. So anyway, sorry, that's a whole nother thing. But anyway, those are my priorities and goals when I think about melody, counter melody, accompaniment, percussion. How does your ensemble develop a unified approach to style articulation? One thing I always encouraged was that the section leaders have an understanding of who has their line, who they play with, et cetera, and make sure that you all have the same articulation, so that when you go to your sections, you're not coming up with your interpretation of how it should be articulated, and you're coming up with your idea of how it should be articulated, right? The section leaders have to have that understanding, right? And of course, the director sets that in place, but that's something, depending on how your band operates with student leaders, that's something that you can encourage the student leaders as a standard operating procedure to do, is know who we play with at what time and how are these things being articulated. And if you have a question, just ask, how do you want us to articulate that? And who else has it, right? But that's something that's real important. So I stress that quite a bit. And I do a lot of singing. Have the band do a lot of singing, right? Because they hear each other a lot easier when they're singing than when they're playing playing instruments, right? So that's something that I do a lot to deal with style and articulation. And educate about style, right? Style, like I often used to say, funk in the feel and the feel is in the accents, right? And when they get that, understand, I say a lot. You smell like what you soak in, right? So you want to smell like jazz, you got to soak in jazz. You want to smell like a particular groove, you got to soak in a groove, right? This is one of the reasons that I'll hear college bands from different areas, and there are certain kinds of music that those bands play very, very well, and other kinds of music that they have to manufacture for, because it's not something that they grew up with, right? A band from Louisiana is going to have a different feel than from Texas, which is going to have a different feel than a band from Mississippi, because they all grew up. Especially when you're dealing with state schools and at least 50% band coming from the same state, which is generally the case with state schools. At least 50% of your bands coming from the same place, and same general geographical locale, and it has a certain vibe, right? You take the uniforms off, I can pretty much tell where a drummer is from. by how they do things, right? And how things feel, right? That's something everybody kind of has to get, right? Now, as a director, you got to play to the strengths, right? A lot of times directors expand our palette and things, expand the, I think that's a good thing, to expand the exposure of what students are able to do. But we have to understand that if they didn't grow up with something, it's not going to sound the same. I'm going to call it the Bruce Willis effect. Bruce Willis is not a great actor, but Bruce Willis has been very successful because people write movies where Bruce Willis can be Bruce Willis. I could say the same for Arnold Schwarzenegger, or I could name a few other actors where I could have this wide range of chops, of acting chops. Is that if I really want to show this person off, then let me write a situation where they can be successful, right? And so part of what we do as directors needs to be that, while we're scaffolding to help expand students are able to be successful at, right? So anyway,
We next had a brief conversation about electronics and groups who are looking to kind of move into that future idea of what electronics can look like when combined with show band.
Typically in show band, electronics are either novelties. We're going to do this cool thing with these electronics, right? Or we're going to do this tune that has this iconic whatever, right? And so we're going to put on the field with, or it's to mitigate missing or weak instrumentation. I don't have a tuba player, but I got a bass player, right? That's the only time, but that's typically the case. Now, a lot of that is because of money, right? Just the financial support that programs have, and the infrastructure that's required for electronics, because electronics requires a trailer. The trailer requires a level of band booster support. There's it's a cascading domino effect. It's just, I could say the same thing about props.
Next, Dr. Singleton and I shifted our conversation over to the visual side of the sheet, and we started with fundamental visual exercises that he uses with his ensembles to instill form control and intervallic relationships.
Things. The first thing, like I mentioned before, angles, 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 angles. So should be lined up with that. This should have this kind of angle. This should be, whatever, because visual is always going to be in relationship to. Intonation is always in relationship to, right? It's always got to be in relationship to a standard. So it's a matter of making sure the students understand the standard, right? So some of the things that I have done is that I recognize, for instance, as you know, in show band and in traditional show band, the two interval, right? A step is 22.5 inches and a two-step interval. And so a lot of people, they using the arm and this, that, and the other. And I was like, yeah, but what if this person has McGill gorilla arms and this person has barn arms, right? So that becomes a thing. So what I did is I got what I call my 1-2 step stick, right? There's an old tune called "Watch Me Do My 1-2 Step." So that was where I got the terminology from. But all it is, piece of PVC cut to 45 inches. And depending on the year, sometimes I made sure that anybody that was working with people on the field had one. And so we spent a lot of time getting understanding. Each individual needs to know what it feels like to be 2 steps away from the next person. Now, another thing that's important is that you can't use your arm, not just because of your arm length, but because of people's girth. If Olive Oil is standing right here and Bluto is standing right here, the interval has nothing to do with their shoulders. The interval has to do with their spine. So what I started teaching my students to do was to use their neighbor's spine. How far are you away from their spine? You know, or this, you know, you can see, you know, the back of their head or whatever, right? And so when they had to learn not how far should my arm reach to their shoulder, how far does my arm reach to touch their spine? That's my two-step interval, right? And a lot of it is learning it, right? Grambling, I don't think well, they're in a new building now, but when I used to teach at Grambling, they had this place called 8 to 5 right? And they had dots on the street. And one of the rites of passage for freshmen at the end of band camp was being able to move the dot block with your eyes closed, right? And nail the lines, right? So a lot of that is just knowing how it feels. Because and also another thing that I teach them is having an awareness that at any given point in time, you want to be equidistant between whatever it is. If I look to the right, it should be the same distance to the person to the left. If I look to the front, it should be the same to the person to the back. And then it doesn't matter whether you're at a 22 and a half, it doesn't matter if you're one-step interval, two-step interval, whether you're at some variant in a curve or whatever. If you are always equidistant between these two people, the pictures look at least like something. You know what I mean? And it'll look logical, right? Because there's no right. So those are things that I really stress with the students, right? Getting an understanding of what it feels like for them to be whatever interval is they're supposed to be away, and getting a feel for no matter what's going on, you need to be equidistant between these people. Another thing I always tell them, you shouldn't be able to see more than one person unless it's a curve. And I say that all the time. You can see somebody, you know, on one side or the other side of this person, something's out of line. This is a curve. This is a curve, right? I talk about compass points a lot. Like some people, some bands, when they do a step 2, they don't mark time. You stand fast until you step off, because they really want to get emphasis of nothing and then and then we go, right? And some people, when they stack up, they stand fast. And sometimes, depending on the music or depending on just what the situation is, we might vary them. You know, on this one, stand fast on the stacker. When you stand fast, right? Sometimes like mark time all the way through. Sometimes it has to do with what comes next. Sometimes it has to do with if coming up to the end of the tune, right? Has to do with maybe we're stacking up and it happens to be towards the audience and everybody's standing fast, start to see. Now that becomes another ripple effect that we get, because everybody's marching and then it goes out and then everybody takes off at the same time, right? So all those are different visual things that you can play with, right? I think that that variation is a luxury for the experienced. That's my advice for doctors. Variations are a luxury of the experienced. The less experienced your group is, the less variation there needs to be in anything. You know, I'm in a band right now. We do Latin rock and salsa and different Latin types of music, and a lot of the tunes that we're covering have a lot of breaks. And this time they waited 2 measures. There's a 2-measure break. Over here is 1 measure. Here it's 4 measure break. They're all going to be 2 measures, so we don't mess it up. Right? Now, a year from now, when we know that this body tunes real well, then it's a lot easier to say, oh, you know what? Let's go ahead and make these variants, add the spice level up a little, add the contrast level and release level up a little bit, right? Some bands are able to go off of visuals. You know, till the cue, or let's just look at each other and do this. But if there's no experience there, and I'm talking about like bands, like cover bands, I'm not talking about marching band. No, you need to know what you're doing when you get on the field. But yeah, but you know, that's you think about bands that I know Southern used to do it, Howard did for a while. Score on the field at halftime, right? Not every band can do that, right? Not every band has the poise to be able to do that. I know one director, he said the score changed score changed 3 times in 5 minutes before that. And so he's running around trying to make sure, did you see the score change? You know, because while the kids are doing their stretches on the side of the field before halftime, they may not be paying attention to the game. He's like, all right, it's this. Okay, no score change, it's this. You know, make sure everybody knew what it was supposed to be.
I really liked what Dr. Singleton had to share with us about recovery from error. He starts at a very basic, don't get noticed, and then just kind of really gets into what recovery from error means for performers.
The first thing is this: what you do not want to do is draw attention to yourself. That is job one. Do not, if you find yourself out there bad, do not draw attention to yourself. You cannot do it, right? That's because all I know, you, there's something wrong right there. After that, it depends on the type of error, and it requires a lot of it requires a decision on the part of the student. For instance, I saw Jackson one time years ago. They came to their concert formation and there was a squad that was off. One squad. What they did was, I think the next tune, if I'm remembering correctly, the next tune was a slow tune. Slid over on the first beat of every measure until they got there. So they're like, whatever it was, and they until they got there. Right? Because the whole band standing still. There's no easy way to make that. If you're in a step 2 and you mess up, you have to know the drill well enough to know, should I just mark time away from step 2? Right? But the main thing I tell anybody is be aware of phrases, whether that's a visual phrase, like when people hit the line and stuff like that, or whether it's a musical phrase. Like if you mess up something, like if a bass player messes up or if a drummer messes up, be aware of like if you didn't come in right, don't come in the middle. Wait until the phrase. Right? Sometimes you have to double down. You turn the wrong way, just keep marching. You know, catch up with the next line and hope they can drop you off where you needed to be, right? It just depends on what it is. My advice to a kid, you know, what I would want a kid to do to recover in a step 2 is going to be different than if they're doing a curve or linear. Right? Yeah, that's, you know, drummers don't pick up the stick. They stick drops, sorry, right? Unless there's a movement, unless you're doing a routine, unless you're doing something where you can make it part of what's going on, right? And see, here's another thing, and this is not an adjudicator's mindset, but from a crowd standpoint, if somebody makes smooth recovery, it gets applauded. They're like, ah, he hooked that up, he worked that out. You know what I mean? Yeah, but those the main thing is don't draw attention to yourself, but that's going to change in different situations. Step 2 is one thing. Those kids are going to stand fast. They're standing, the band is standing still, and you're you are a hole in the picture. Try and figure it out as smoothly as possible. And sometimes the best thing to do is to just fix it quick.
Right.
And hope nobody notices.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, oh snap, what is that? Welch's? Was that the Welch commercial? Where the person was marching the wrong way and they turned around and ran?
Right.
That's probably not the best thing, but maybe just turn around and keep marching until you catch up.
Yeah.
You know, adjusted step, right? So those are some things that I would tell. It's different, you know, dance routine, different kind of thing, right? Like if you went up and everybody else went down, you might want to wait till everybody comes up.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Commit, right? Make people wonder when they're looking at you, okay, was that choreographed? Was that on purpose? You know, and then just blend back, right? Color guard, whole different animal.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so yeah, it goes back to the way I put it, I wrote it down was rapid recognition that you're in error and a smooth adjustment that calls as little attention to itself as possible. Advice. It's going to look different situations. All right. So, all right. Content questions. How do you ensure the effective numbers on the field? Try and make sure they all pass their grades.
That's a big deal in Texas. You're right.
That's a big deal in a lot of places, but yeah, it's a big deal. Yeah, but yeah, that's, you know, and unfortunately, perhaps the most consistently successful strategy is having alternates. You know, that it is what it is. You know, you want everything to be squared away. You need to have somebody that you can plug in. And the other thing is, as a director, I have to plan very well as far as knowing what I have personnel-wise, right? And then I can't get so stuck on whatever my idea is that it's not effective with the ensemble. What do I mean by that? I'm so stuck on this picture, like between the, you know, the, I don't know, between the 35 and the 35, and it just doesn't look right. I would go ahead and make it from the 30 to the 30 and cut something else off later in the show. It'll work, right? Or I'm so stuck on trying to sell this thing and I don't have enough students. Or I have, yeah, say not enough students or too many students, right? Where I can't see the spaces between the rows, going back, right? You know, a lot of people don't think about the fact that if you want to see space between this person and the person behind them, 16 steps minimum to be sure that you can see a space. So if I'm spelling an E and I'm trying to make it very condensed, E because the center bar is just too small, right? So I have to be aware. That's just me as a director making sure I plan well, and that I'm realistic about this stuff, and use the tools that I have at my disposal, whether it's Pieware or whether that's, you know, I don't have Pieware. You know what my mom used to do? She was a theater person. She used HO scale army men to block her shows. She
That's
used
really
my
smart.
army men. She used my army men on a piece of graph paper. She had drawn out the furniture and stuff to block her shows. So you don't have Pieware, you know, you want to see what something's going to look like? Go to the dollar store, army men, and then you can get a 3D version of what things will actually look like, right? So I mean, but that is me being, you know, proactive about trying to make sure the stuff is right. You know, and a lot of that is going to be on the director's side, right? So yeah, that's what you know, make sure that I plan well to be able to utilize all this, right? When writing teaching drill, what do you look for to ensure the audience judges see appropriate visual reinforcement of music? What I wrote down was, well, this is certainly valued. Many bands put new music with older drills. Perhaps the most iconic example is Southern University. Any band that does downfield drills and or step two drills recycles material at some point. That said, visual elements should line up with the elements, which usually happens at section changes, right? Here's this part. It's kind of like it's kind of like instinct. When you're doing like a diamond drill or a circle drill, the students even know. They know, oh, so rotate it at such and such a part in the music, because they know, we're doing diamonds. Here's the bridge of the music. We already know. Is it 8, 16 to 16? What are we doing, right? As far as the rotation is concerned. So yeah, that's what I do. Make sure sections line up, right? And see, that's something on the judges' side you got to recognize. The average show is way more than one show a year. Talking about the UIL thing, and unfortunately, and there's derision, there's unnecessary derision on both sides, right? Anybody that does something different than we do, we talk about them bad. That's what we do, right? I'm on the course style side. Oh, the reason their shows are sloppy is because they do so many shows a year. I'm on the show band side. The reason their show looks so clean is because they only do one show a year. You know what I mean? I've even encountered that on the jazz band, in the jazz band world up here, where I've heard judges talk about, and been doing that tune, those same tunes since January. So just so he could be ready, or worse, since September. Here we are in April. And so who loses out? The kids. The students lose out, right? Anyway, I just look for, does it feel right? This doesn't feel right. When I hear something change in music, I'm seeing something change on the field, right? That's it. I don't want to go across am I going across bars? Am I going across phrases, right? Does this picture take too long to make? Or does this formation take too long to make? Or, I will, and even if I'm recycling, I'll go back and make adjustments. We'll start the band 5 yards earlier or 5 yards later, because this tune has has a 6-bar phrase instead of an 8-bar phrase, instead of a 4-bar phrase, whatever, right? And I'll do that so that we can make sure we hit, and the hits are where they need to be, and the about faces are where they need to be, and the visuals are where they need to be. So I just listen to the music, and I use a contour sheet. That's something I learned way, 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 way back when I was in grad school under Bentley Shellerhammer at Florida State. He a contour sheet. It simply has all the bars. It has 1, 2, 3, 4. It has a little square for each bar, and you listen to the music, and you just write out, okay, here's the intro. It ends at this bar. Here's this part. It ends at this bar. So now I know how many counts each part of the music is, and I create my drill based on that. Or if here's the part of the music where the trumpets have the melody, I'll make a little note before I even write the drill. Trumpets have the melody right here. When I can. If you're recycling, the music or the drill, you kind of have to make things fit. But I always started with that. I always started, right? And I think I did a digital version of it so I can go on the computer later on. But yeah, I always start with that, and that way I know before I started where those things are. That's just good drill design. Whether you're doing show band, or excuse me, one sec. I accidentally know. Now, my son has a doctor's appointment a little bit, and that was the.
We next talked a little bit about content and the idea of what show bands are known for, and what he aims for judges to notice about pacing and exertion levels, especially pacing.
Okay, so I've worked for some head directors that wanted a continuous motion show. Right, so a lot of show band shows, you'll see them da 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 da. Then start off the next thing. He didn't want that. He wanted a transition. It's the 4 taps or something, right? So that way the drum line, right? A lot of the way from the chop standpoint, goes to the drum line. And some of the weight also goes to the announcer. Because announcing in show band is part of it, right? It's part of the part of the audience engagement. Interestingly, I was at a convention, and I was talking to somebody that had gone to another school, and they were with their head band director. They're like, "Oh, you were at Texas Southern?" And the band director said, "Yeah, he was the voice." And she was like, "Oh, right." You know what I mean? So there were years, decades where bands did not change voices. Like the voice of the band was as much a part of the show as the band itself, and what the person would say. Just like sports announcers team, Okay, so there's that. So a lot of the weight goes to the percussion section. A lot of the weight goes to creative entrances and stalling tactics if you need it, right? Like the next tune features the dancers. Well, let's give them a tuba and drum intro. Gives the band a quick second to get that off their face, right? The quick step maneuver that you see a lot of bands do, the scramble quick step that a lot of bands do to get into dance routine formation. One thing that the most challenging thing after that is the first note. You just did this for a minute. Yeah. Right? So a lot of times right there's a quick announcement, maybe some drum taps, just something to let the be able to get that ready. And then preparation. My hands were in shape, right? And I would have some people I worked with was kill, but my students always told me we felt like we could do another halftime after halftime, right? So that's another thing that's just super, super important, right? Here's another thing. Another thing about pacing is the arrangements, right? What key are you? I won't say unfortunately. One of the things about show band music is that it's high, it's brassy, it's in your face. Right? And what I tell student arrangers a lot of times is that's a great tune for the first tune in the fifth quarter, but what if it's the eighth tune? Will we still be able to play it and sound good? Right? There was a tune we used to use at Texas Southern that my former boss did arrangement of Black and Blues, and we always use leaving the stadium. Always, always, always. And I would tell students, why do you think Black and Blues said always, no matter how many tunes we played, no matter what we did all day, Black and Blues hits going out the stadium? Why? And they always say the same, because it's written in the meat of the range. It's written in the meat of the range, right? So that's a director's thing that you got to, if you're doing 10-minute show, you got to know, if you got this high note for your trumpets right here, you can't start that next tune with a high note trumpet intro, right? So you just, again, this is planning on the director's part, right? You want to put the students in a position to where they can be successful. All right, I know you got to go. I am happy to do this again. I literally could talk about this all day. I don't know if you know, my dissertation was Black Band for Brown Students, and it dealt a lot specifically with of adjudicated performances and how that affects people.
Lastly, there was a spot earlier in the interview, and I've moved it here to the back, just kind of an overarching concept of visual design and visual instruction. So I just put the subtitle visual here and just let this run because I thought it just contained so much great information.
Okay, I'm going to go directly to marching style. Okay, if you look at the style, which is the source material for this, which is HBCU bands, right? If you look at the source material, bands have a horn swing, which off the bat is antithetical to traditional TMAA thinking, right? Because you would want to keep the horn as still as possible because we are embouchure and tone, airflow, all of that. I get it, right? But the source style for this, the source style for this genre, there is a horn swing because it is as visual as it is sonic. So that needs to be considered. Rocking, a horn rock, right? You know, not just a swing, but the idea of rocking so that the plume moves a certain way, so that the cape moves a certain way. Right? If you look at Southern University, which probably has arguably the most effective cape style, which a lot of people don't remember, comes from the Big Ten, right? And from Michigan State, right? When they used to march the same way, right? But the material on Southern University's when it just kind of swishes, right? And that's one of the things that a lot of the bands are trying to do with the capes is to get that swish. And when they turn, to intentionally whip that cape, right? So that there's a color flash. The same reason that we have it's become less of a thing on core style bands because there's a lot less visual turning. But the whole idea of having a contrasting color on the front and the back, so that when a turn happens, you get to color, right? And this is something that is valued in show band that isn't necessarily as important in core style, because now most of the time in core style, when people turn around, is usually not as much for visual as it is to be somewhere, right? I mean, theatrical movement notwithstanding, you know, not talking about theatrical movements, right? The main reason that you'll see somebody place their belt to the other side is because, okay, I don't want this to be as loud. I want to diminish this intensity or impact of what they're doing, so we're going to turn them around, right? But in show band, that is not why people turn around. People turn around to go the other way. You know what I mean? To go the other way, and that they want that visual that happens right with that, right? And the idea of accenting on 8, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's a visual thing. Has nothing to do with sound, but it affects the sound. But the visual is important. Turn around, doing it about 5, 6, up, down, and around, right? These are things that are visually part of style that do affect sound, but that is not a flaw. It is a feature, right? And that's something that needs to be recognized. Okay, so that's a challenge faced by a performer in a show band, right? Marching style, again, knee lift is a challenge faced by a performer in a show band. Some bands address this different ways. Some bands intentionally, again, if you got the spats in a show band, the spats are there to highlight, or one of the reasons is to highlight high knee. So what some bands do is they intentionally hem the pants just a little bit shorter, so that with it takes less height on the knee in order to accent, to make it, to get a good visual. If that makes sense, right? So that is a challenge faced by a show band performer. Angle of the leg in the marching style is a challenge faced by a show band performer. Is it a chair step? Where the knee is more out, where the front part of the leg, sorry, is more out, or is it a tuck? See, I can't do that with my wrist. Sorry. Or is it a tuck step? Right. You know, if you look at a Big Ten school and how their knees lift, then you look at maybe a FAMU or Alabama State, where the knee, where the foot is tucked more towards the supporting leg, right? So these are challenges. I talk about it all the time whenever I teach a marching band, with leg shape. right? Is making sure that your leg shape is like everybody else, and different bands do it different ways. And that's another thing. There are nuances of style from band to band, talking about the source band level, at the HBCU band level, that are done a certain way to be intentionally distinctive, right? Uh, there are, I know that there are things that different corps do to be intentionally distinctive, but there are less variants across the core style than there are in the show band world. Okay. Yeah, and so that's a challenge, right? And so one of the things for directors is to make sure that everybody is using the same source. Because what can happen is this kid loves Jackson's, this kid loves Southern, this kid loves this kid loves Prairie View, right? And so people are watching these tapes, and that's where they want to go to school. And this is what in their mind they're doing. The same way that a high school football player likes, Tom Brady, or likes, whoever they like, right? And so they're picking up characteristics that they're getting from the videos of these players that may or may not fit coaching scheme, the strategy that the coaching game plans that the coach has, right? So that's something that directors need to make sure that they do, even though they may acknowledge, yeah, all these are good bands, all these are different ways of doing it, but the way we're doing it is this, and that's super super important. That the students have an understanding for directors to communicate what identify the hallmark of this. And that said, and I know I'm probably jumping around a little bit, but it goes with this, is angle, right? Body mechanics and angles. That's how I teach it. I tell them what their angle should be lined up with. Where should their ankle be in relationship to their knee? Where should their toe be pointed in relationship to their shin? Where should their arm be? Where should your elbow be in relationship to your body? Where should your fist be in relationship to your shoulder? Is it by your shoulder? Is it by your shoulder muscle? Is it across your sternum? All these are things, alignment aspects are that are stressed, whether I was teaching my own band or if I was doing a clinic with a high school band, is identify clear where everything is supposed to be. Theoretically, not always practically, theoretically, I should be able to, with words, tell a student what should be where, and everybody should be pretty close, right? I should be able to say your heels are together, your feet are at a 45 angle, your shoulders are aligned with your hips, your thumb is aligned with the inseam, right? Whatever the case may be, all of those things should be identified. I mean, even as simple as taking a picture and having your leaders in the band describe, what do you see? How what's the thing in the comic strip, Hocus Focus, where they've got two ideas and you're supposed to see what the differences are. That's something that I teach that I would use with my leaders. We would have some people do things wrong, and you need to figure out what it is. But in order to identify those things, if you have some people line up and say, okay, what's different between these people? What's the same between people? Where do we want it? And as a director, that's the thing that you need to get your students to understand, right? And that they recognize it. The student leaders have to be able to recognize it, because if they don't recognize, you only have, director only has one set of eyes, right? Everybody needs to be looking for the same thing, right? And that said, I'm glad you're going to be able to edit this later, because I realize now I'm going down a clinic path here. That said, everybody should be able to use the same descriptors, because then once it becomes part of the vocabulary for your band, it becomes much easier to pass down, right? And you don't have to worry about when the next set of freshmen come in that they're being taught something differently. if that makes sense, right? So yeah, you mentioned buzzwords in there, but everybody's gonna have their own buzzwords, but you need to have them. They need to have what is it supposed to look like, whatever analogy, whatever that you need to have. You need to have those, and your leaders need to have them and be able to communicate that effectively, right? So I tell my students that in order to be a good educator, you have to be able to do two things. First, is explain something 5 times the exact same way for consistency. Second, be able to explain the same thing 5 different ways because everybody doesn't get it the same way. But I do firmly believe that there should be a central standard way that it is communicated, and then that's where the individual teaching comes in as far as, okay, they're not getting this, one other ways that they can think of it, right? Like in the Ocean of Soul, when I was teaching there, we had a thing we called rock the boat, right? That was what we call our marching style. It's like the boat needs to rock, right? And we talked about I call it a triangle between your embouchure and your elbows. That triangle should never change, right? That was my way of getting at the idea of making sure your embouchure is not moving on the horn, but that this entire piece is moving together so that we would get the visual that we were looking for, but we would also be able to put as much attention on effective playing technique as well, right? But not sacrifice. I mean, there's going to be sacrifice, right? Anytime you decide to do something visual, it's going to affect what you're doing as far as playing the instrument is concerned, the instrument character is concerned. But in order to embrace the style and be able to put forth what needs to be put forth aesthetically and for genre, that was how I dealt with it, right? And that's going to vary from band to band, right? To what value. And obviously consistency is the main thing. All right, let me see if I can get back on track. So technical rhythmic precision perspective, what is much so yeah, we talked a lot as respect relates to visual content. So horn carriage, having flash, and having the visual elements without negligently sacrificing sonic characteristics. They are going to be compromised. There is no way that I can sound the same doing this. It is impossible. And on the judge's side, don't look for that, right? And that's what I mean. That's one of the things I was referring to earlier when I talked about what the frame of reference for a judge is, for an adjudicator. Because if you were raised all your life that the sonic production, sacrifice nothing from the sonic side of it, and that a lot of our visuals have come from the drum corps, is because we want it to sound a certain way. And so everything geared towards that. And everything, I had a talk one time with a guy, and he was trying to understand Shan, and we came to a conclusion that in show band, if it's not entertaining, what would you do? And for drum corps is, if you can't do it perfectly clean, why would you do it? And that's what determines. Consider what you hear. I use a lot of drum references because I'm a percussionist. Consider what you hear from drum corps drum lines in the parking lots when they're playing stuff that they play for them versus what you hear on the field. There's much greater exposure to risk in the parking lot because they have somebody staring at them. Nope, messed it up, right? You're probably
Once again, I want to express my thanks for your watching this video, watching this series of videos, hopefully helping to grow your show band. If you're an adjudicator, your ability to effectively offer commentary to our show bands here in Texas.